So I felt kind of fortunate to have this passage to look at today. This is in the lectionary, and because it's not familiar, it wasn't familiar to me at all. I don't know much about Tabitha, and I kept thinking, gosh, I was a woman in divinity school. You would have thought I know something about her, but I really don't. So it was kind of an interesting discussion, and to spend a little time really digging into her life, and also what this particular passage in Acts I think is meant to do for us right now. So I'm going to take a little time and identify some unique pieces that this passage points up that I think we haven't seen in Scripture, especially Luke and Acts up to this point. There's a whole bunch of sort of pointers in this passage that I think will lead us to think again about what post-Jesus resurrection meant, basically. So remember that this is after Easter, so Jesus has risen, has then ascended, and now you've got the community kind of trying to deal with what's going on now. What are we left with? We don't have Jesus anymore as our king or leader, and trying to figure out how to make the most sense of the community that they have. We also think that this passage was probably written about 100 years after Jesus died, so it's actually probably the community sort of looking back and going, okay, where are we now? And what are we going to do? And I guess I would encourage us as Origin to think about that. I mean, we're always kind of critiquing, but also thinking about what's our role in our community and what's our responsibility to our community. If you were here last week, you'd also remember that Red Hawk talked about Paul and Saul and that shift. So Saul was on the road, basically got hit with lightning, was able to see, and became Paul. But what you have at this particular passage in Acts then is that you have the shift now from talking about Paul and the community to talking about Peter. So you've got this sort of shift. And what are the disciples doing out in the community? What's their responsibility? How are they carrying through in this new Christian community that really nobody knows what it's going to look like, and trying to create a new world? So here's some things that were really unique about this passage. It actually was fun to do this. I don't want to do it a lot, but it was interesting to look at Tabitha. So first of all, this is the first time in the New Testament that you have a female called a disciple. So you don't see that terminology anywhere else, and that's kind of a unique thing. It's, I think, something to pay attention to. Is we don't have the term methatria, which is the female term for disciples. It wasn't used before. So, we all know that we tend to have the women were relegated to the background. They were sort of just the background of the story, and often you didn't really have a mention of who they were or what they did. And so the fact that all of a sudden you have this woman called this is sort of a big deal. And so I'd suggest that really it's a way of getting our attention to what's a new community mean after Christ? How do we do this? And that probably one of the things is that women have a more significant role in the community, and they're actually named. I mean, that's sort of a big deal. We know that there were many women who followed Jesus, many women who were around Jesus, but none of them received that term, that disciples term, in Scripture. Now, let me list for you some of the names. I mean, it's pretty amazing how many women were named in Scripture. So Mary, Martha, Elizabeth, Mary Magdalene, Chloe, Lydia, Priscilla, Phoebe, Lurcia, Euodia. These are names I don't know very well. Syntyche. And then there's this whole piece of women that are called the something. They're unnamed women like the Syrophoenician woman, the woman at the well, the woman with the blood flow, the forgiven woman. So they're not named at all. So not only do we not have a title for them, we don't really know what they're called. And so the fact that you have Tabitha named, and interestingly enough, when you were reading, I was looking at the message, but Tabitha was also called Dorcas is another name, and that translates as gazelle. So not only was she named, but then she was also named as having a significant role. So you have these kind of two really important things being lifted up, and kind of unusual. Another thing about Tabitha that I think this passage points us to is that not only was her name Tabitha, but Dorcas, and so she was crossing the cultural divide between Hebrew and Greco-Roman. So those two names come from two types of communities, one Hebrew and one Greco-Roman. And so that tells you that I think in terms of the passage, what we're really hearing is this is starting to be now a crossover of communities. We're no longer talking just about the Hebrew community or the hopefulness that Jesus will live again within the Hebrew community and grow and create a new community, but also that Greco-Roman place, those Gentiles like us. So she's got two names, and it's sort of indicating to me anyway that she's really somebody who's got a foot in both types of worlds. Another really interesting thing about this passage that, again, helps me see that this is a movement to a whole new community, and again, I think it speaks to us as a new community, is that Peter does the raising, okay? Peter raises her. Jesus is not around anymore, but Peter does the act, and it's a significant act, and we haven't really known other people to do this. So now we have that shared responsibility of somebody doing what Jesus used to do. Now it's Peter. And I think I would hear that as, now we all have responsibility for these kinds of things. Now we have responsibility to continue this community and to create a new world. Another piece that's really unique about this passage is that a woman is raised. It's not the first time that that's happened in the New Testament. We had actually Tabitha earlier in Luke, who was also raised. But the fact that we have a woman going through this experience again indicates this is a new world. We're talking about a new way of being together, a new way of experimenting with who we are and how to build community. And it's not in line with what the cultural norms of the time expected or wanted. It's really challenging all the notions of how we are community together. Now, Tabitha was also a very prominent woman. She's defined, and the picture is great here. She was a sewer, so she was making clothing for the widows, which is partly why they were so pained with her death. But she was also very prominent, and some of the language that's used to describe her not only describes her as name, but she was probably a wealthy woman. She was probably a philanthropist to the church. But here she was making things for widows, sewing, doing a craft for them. And so she not only had privilege, but saw her privilege as leading her to have some responsibility within the community. Now, the other piece about that that's kind of unique is you've got widows rejoicing. Now, where in the New Testament have we ever heard of widows rejoicing? Usually widows are hurt. The community isn't always good for them. Jesus' message to us is that widows, in fact, should be cared for, but haven't been cared for before. And so all of a sudden, you've got this shift that widows are actually, they're thrilled that Tabitha has been resurrected, that she's been raised from the dead. So here's a whole different way of looking at widows, that they bring a very positive and enthusiastic response to the community. Another piece of the story that's sort of a first, although we should be fairly familiar with the style, is that at the very end, you might remember that Peter goes to visit a tanner. That happens to be an unclean occupation within the Hebrew community. So not unlike hanging out with Lazarus or any of those people, here Peter's showing an example of, Jesus did this. Jesus was with these kinds of people. I will do that too. So that continuation of no divide. It's not about privilege. It's not about us versus them. It's we're all in this together, whether one is Hebrew or Greco-Roman, whether one is unclean or participating in unclean acts, that the whole community is now kind of split open, and the recognition that, in fact, we all come to this together to change the world, to create a kingdom. So let me just really quickly remind you of the story. So Tabitha is this sort of prominent woman. She's been caring for widows, and that's sort of how she's known, and then she dies. So she dies, and the widows are crying and upset, and they send for Peter, who's at a village not very far from us at this time in Joppa, and he comes, and they actually talk in the passages, they talk a little bit about, sometimes they take her to an upper room. Some of the language is upper room, which is again sort of modeling what happened with Jesus. Sometimes they talk about it being in a cold room, but nevertheless, she had extra rooms in her home, which means that she was a wealthy woman. And Peter comes and resurrects her, basically. And so then the widows are thrilled again and excited that they have received this woman who's been their caretaker. So you see new expressions of community breaking out all over. There's all these places where the things we used to do, the things we know as norm, are not the norm anymore. And we got the message from Jesus, and now we're getting it from the disciples, from Peter and Paul, and also Tabitha. So the community was transformed. In some ways, Tabitha, you might look at the metaphorical definition of her making clothing for the widows as caring for people who are not generally cared for in our community. That whatever message we get from this passage, I think it is one of, we throw out all the rules, that we create a new community. We don't divide people by having and not having, or us and them, but now we start shaking it up and taking away all those divisions and recognizing that the community that Jesus called us to create is one of openness and support and not one of separation and division. And even the widows, the fact that they are rejoicing is an indication to me that this is a whole new world. We don't have widows being upset anymore. Widows are being excited and thrilled, and they have support in their community. As one theologian wrote that I read this week, stated, these widows lived and moved out of an optimism of grace. So the whole community, the whole place was transformed. And even, I thought this was very interesting, even Joppa, which was where this took place with Tabitha. Joppa, does anybody remember what Joppa was before? I mean, I didn't really remember this either, but Joppa was a community that when Jonah was called to go try to save Nineveh, he ran away to Joppa, okay? So the use of the city of Joppa in this passage is, that's a place where people used to go to get away from doing good things. Here, all of a sudden, it's a place where good things happen. So again, even the placement, the geography is a different way of looking at life, that it's a new community. So the Christian community really became transformed. We saw people being raised from the dead, not Jesus doing that, but Peter. Women were leaders. Widows were heard and cared for. The tanner, even though rejected, was welcomed by this new community, and real change was happening all over.